We're getting quieter. All right, well, thank you all for sticking with us through the afternoon. I don't think you'll regret it. Found out that we had Dr. John Jansen speaking today, and I thought, hey, I used to work with him. And I had a big, long, formal introduction. We haven't really gone to these today. I'm just going to say that John, pun intended, John is a rock star geologist. I know that's what others called him when we worked together at a previous firm. But he does work all over the country. He is a geophysicist and a hydrogeologist. How many times have you come to a conference and gotten to hear a geophysicist? Right? And he's going to talk to us about chlorides in groundwater, a rising concern, something some of us have been thinking about for a long time.
So just to set the record straight, he said they called me a rock star. They actually called me a rock head, and that's not quite the same thing. I'm really happy to be here today. This is a topic I've been kind of aware of for over 40 years. Back in like 1979, I was an undergrad, and my professor hooked me up with one of the few hydrogeologists that was working in the state. And I had a part-time job working as like a little junior geologist for one of the big well drilling companies that work with most of the municipalities. And they had a hydrogeologist. In my hometown, we were working for my hometown. I won't mention their name to protect the people who aren't innocent. My hometown had a well that had very high chlorides. And they just asked this hydrogeologist when we were looking for another well for him. And he looked around and he said, well, he told them to stop storing their snow in the parking lot of the park that was next to the well. And I'm like, huh? And they stopped doing that. And the chloride started to go down because it was all the road salt in that snow. And so I heard about that, 40 some years ago. And it kind of stuck in the back of my head, but I never really thought much about it. That experience that town had sparked a road salt study that they did to look at chlorides in their wells in the late 80s. And they found a direct correlation between road salt and chloride in their wells. So, and now it is 40 years later, and they have done nothing about it. Several of those wells are now over the MCL. So I'm not naming any names. I'm just saying this is a very difficult problem. I didn't really do much with it until like 20 years ago. I started seeing good well sites that we'd go out and find well sites for cities. And then we'd find very high chlorides. We'd have to walk away from those well sites. And it started to be more and more common. So I started thinking something's up. And so for about the last 10 years or so, I've been giving talks at various places, just trying to get the awareness out there. So I'd like to just kind of share with you what I've kind of come up with, and hopefully, yeah, that cursor works. No, it doesn't. Okay. So this is a study that the USGS did, published a few years ago, and they're looking at chloride levels rising in streams across the country. There's like 19 streams, 30 locations, and you can see the locations. Oh, I wish that worked. Anyway, you can see the locations sprinkled around the country. This is the Fox River watershed. And this is kind of a summary of the results. And each of these are a graph of the water quality from 1980 to 2010, so 30 years of data. And the black lines are chlorides in the winter, and the gray line, which you can kind of see on some of these, are chloride levels in the summer. And the red colors at the top, that the degree of red on these graphs relates to the percent impervious surface, paved surfaces in the watershed. So these red areas up here on top, these are 50% or higher. And you get down here to the white ones, and these are, just a few percent. And what you can't see is the scale of the chlorides. These upper ones, it's 0 to 1,000. Down here, it's 0 to 40. So you can see that impervious surface is directly related to the amount of chloride getting into these streams. And you can maybe also see that these down here, the gray and the black lines are right on top of each other. There's not a big difference between winter and spring. And these are in like the 10 to 15 parts per million chloride. Up here, we're at 700, 600, and there's a big difference between winter and spring. So that's a hint of where the chloride is coming from. Just kind of zero in on, this is actually southeastern Wisconsin, and we're going to be looking at Peshtigo up in by Green Bay, and we're going to be looking at the Fox River and the Kinnickinnic River area. So this is actually the Peshtigo River, and this is up here where it's almost, you know, it's the northern woodlands, and what you'll see is that there's not much of a difference between the winter and fall. These are all kind of in the single digits. So low impervious surface, low chlorides. Now we move to the Milwaukee River, kind of in the northern watershed. So it's kind of intermediate between rural and urban. It's kind of more of an agricultural. And now we're in that 100 to 150 range. And it's high in the winter and lower in the fall. But we're still in, you know, kind of reasonable ranges on chlorides. And as we move to the Kinnickinnic, which is highly urbanized, a lot of impervious surface, now we're looking at 600 in the winter and, you know, 200 in the fall. So high impervious surface, high urbanized, high chlorides. Here are the chlorides in the Fox River of Illinois. This is data from 2010, 2011. And you can see the mean concentrations are in the 100 to 130 range. Maximums are getting up to like 250, 300, 370. And I bet that the levels are considerably higher now. So even like in Madison, Wisconsin, the big lakes, the Yahara Lakes chain, chloride levels have been rising. That data going back to 1938. They are now in some of these lakes, they're 50% to 10 times higher in the lakes. And some of the lakes are getting up there, like Wingra is up over 80 parts per million chloride. This is some data from Northeast Illinois. This is actually electrical conductivity, which is being used as a proxy for chlorides. So you can kind of cut these values in half from conductivity to chlorides. So basically what you're seeing though is the conductivity has basically more than doubled in the 15 years of data. So, you know, chloride levels are going up in the lakes here too. Even Lake Michigan, you know, I think there are something like 4 quadrillion gallons of water in Lake Michigan, but it's got a 100-year turnover time. We've been putting road salt on the roads long enough. Chlorides are coming up in Lake Michigan too. So they've risen about 40% between 1980 and about 2010. I saw some data recently, and it's continuing to go up. So even in Lake Michigan, it's still at very low levels, but it's higher than it was, and it's getting into the range where it might start impacting certain species. So what are the chloride sources in the environment? There are a lot of sources of chloride. You know, there's winter maintenance is the one I've been talking about, but there's other things. There's wastewater, septic, there's industrial water. There's all kinds of sources, and they all kind of make their way into the environment. Some of them go directly by runoff into lakes and streams. Some of them get into groundwater. And as you know, groundwater is the base flow for lakes and streams. So this pathway to the lakes and streams can be fairly rapid. This pathway through the groundwater into the lakes and streams, that can take decades. And what we have to realize here is when we get to the point where the groundwater chloride levels are approaching toxic levels for organisms in lakes and streams, now it's going to be very difficult to deal with it, because this is something that will go on for decades. And this is the water that's coming into the lakes and streams when we don't have precipitation. So this is kind of a constant bleed of chlorides into our lakes and streams. So if this gets too high, we really have our hands tied in terms of dealing with it. So salt use by industry across the US, this data is about 10 years old, but it's still pretty decent. There's a long list of sources of chlorides: agricultural, de-icing, various chemical feeds. Basically, as of 2005, the de-icing is now the #1 use of chloride, road salt, or salt in the country. It passed basically chemical feedstocks, but all the other sources, much lower use. So what's the history of salt? Actually, I read a book called Salt. It's about that thick, and it's just about the history of salt. And if you think that's a boring thing, you should read it. For the longest time, salt was the major source of preserving food. It was a critical resource. A lot of places that people live, they don't have enough salt in their diet to deal with the hot climate. So salt was always a very critical element. So there were, you've heard of these salt works where people, would work to produce salt, for thousands of years they've been doing this. And it was a very valuable commodity that was traded around the Mediterranean world. They'd have caravans moving salt up towards the Mediterranean and trading for gold. So it was a big deal. The word salary has its Roman origins in the word salt. So they would pay people in salt, and you needed salt to survive. So if someone said, you got to be worth your salt, that was a very literal concern in the ancient world. Of course, it's not like that anymore. Now we have sources of salt. This is under Lake Michigan on the Michigan side, where they're mining just, big beds of salt. So salt is now cheap. It's now readily available, and it's been, its use has exploded. And one of the biggest uses is de-icing. Road salt has made traffic a lot safer in the winter. Marquette did a study about 10, 15 years ago, excuse me, where they found that de-icing, winter practices, has cut accidents by 88% from pre-salting levels. So, I mean, that's fantastic. They say that salting crews have probably saved more lives than firefighters. So, I mean, you have to think about that. We don't even worry about getting to work on most snowy days. When I was a kid, sometimes you'd have to stay home for a couple days. We don't think about that anymore. And I don't think we're ever going to go back to accepting the fact that when it snows, the city might shut down for 2 days. People won't accept that. Right now, about 43% of all the salt that's produced is used for de-icing. But I don't think we're ever going to get away from that. We're always going to want clear roads. So we have to recognize that for all the downside, there's been a tremendous upside for society. Our roads are now safe. So just jumping to Illinois, the Illinois State Water Survey had some good data. This is the uses of chloride salt in Illinois, and what jumps out is the two biggest users are road salt and fertilizer. Fertilizer has a little bit of chloride in it. So those are the two biggest users. Road salt is a little higher, but not that much. But what jumps out is when you look at the concentration of the fluids that are the waste fluids leaving, road salt runoff is very high. Like this is 8,000 median chloride levels from road salt runoff. Agriculture runoff from like drain tiles, it's in the tens. This is like 18 to 36. So when you're looking at concentrations that are getting into the hundreds of parts per million, it's not coming from agricultural runoff. It's coming from road salt. So that's the culprit. It's our clean roads in the winter are causing us problems with our lakes and streams. So there are ways to fingerprint salt. If you do have an issue, it's not always going to be road salt. But if you do have an issue, there are geochemical ways to fingerprint road salt. One of the big things is looking at the ratio of chloride to bromide in the water. And there's characteristic ratios that are shown in this cross plot. Basically, landfill leachate and some other things fall in this one area, but road salt and septic and wastewater kind of fall in the same area. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but you can also use other things like they put ferrocyanide in road salt to keep it from caking. So if you detects a ferrocyanide, it's a road salt source. There are also other things in wastewater that are not going to be in road salt. Various indicators like artificial sweeteners, some medications that pass through the body, they will show up in wastewater. They're not going to be in road salt. So you can fingerprint where the salt is coming from. The studies that I've looked at, it's anywhere from 60 to 90% of the chloride entering the environment is from road salt, with water softeners and sewer systems being the secondary source. So what are the issues associated with road salt or chloride? There's a MCL, it's a secondary MCL, drinking water standard, if you will, of 250 parts per million. And it's not really a health issue, it's more aesthetics. Once it gets above 250 parts per million, it starts making spots on things that you're washing, and it has a funny flavor, a funny mouthfeel. So that's a secondary standard. Sodium, though, does have a health risk. People with high blood pressure are recommended not to have more than 20 parts per million in their drinking water. So that is what do they call it? A drinking water equivalency guideline. It's a guideline of 20 parts per million. There is toxicity to aquatic organisms. The EPA has got a surface water standard for chronic exposure of 230 parts per million, and that's based on toxicity to organisms. And they have an acute standard. So the chronic standard is long-term exposure. Acute standard of 860. So that's for like a short duration exposure, higher level. And IEPA has a level at 500 for acute and nothing for chronic. I will say that from the stuff I've read, there are changes in the populations well below that 230 part per million chronic standard. Some people will say, when you start getting into the, around 100, you're having significant impacts. So that's the standard, but that doesn't mean that below that is safe. And there's huge costs related to the use of road salt. You'll see numbers thrown around like $3.5 to $7 billion a year just in corrosion to your car or infrastructure, and cars of over $4 billion a year. And I've seen numbers even higher than that. So it's billions of dollars a year it's costing us in rusting out bridges and rusting out cars. And the road salt application rates are going up. I know there's been a lot of talk about trying to come up with ways to minimize salt use using alternative sources, but it is still rising in the country. One of the reasons is that we've just got more and more miles of road that we're treating. So even if we're using less salt on each mile, if we have more miles, we're still using more salt. So right now it's around, in 2010, it was about 22 million tons per year. I've seen numbers now that estimate today it's about 30 million tons. Since the 1980s, there's been an aggressive effort to reduce it. There is a recent trend, and I mean recent in the last 5 or 10 years, to go to brine instead of rock salt. And that has cut application rates significantly. So there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon that maybe we can bring the salt use down. But if we keep applying more salt, more miles of road, it'll start to rise again. So this is some data that Dane County, Wisconsin put out. And this is their road salt use for going back from like 1980 to, I think this is like 2015. But you can see basically, 2019. Road salt use was going up consistently. They switched to brining, and there was a drop of about 30%. So that's very that's very hopeful. If we can all go to brining, we can maybe take a step down. But if you see, the rates look like they're starting to creep up again. As you do more lane miles, you're going to start using more salt, even if we had a step down. So this is just the states that apply most of the road salt. They call it the salt belt. Michigan and Wisconsin are kind of the buckle on the salt belt. Okay. Application rates are up to 23 tons per mile in places in Michigan. There's a spot in New York that's reported 300 tons per mile. Typical is more like the 5 to 10 tons per mile range. Parking lots get salted very heavy. Nobody wants to get sued because they slipped in the Home Depot parking lot, or heaven forbid, if you've ever seen a hospital parking lot in the winter, it looks like a powdered donut, right? Because they don't want anybody slipping in the hospital parking lot. They can boot up to 40 tons per acre, and an acre is about a lane mile. So it's about 4 times as much salt as they're using on roads. So if you're looking at calculating salt loading, the big box parking lots are almost a bigger source than the roads could be. So what's the problem? Road salt use is continuing to rise. It's a big problem in surface water, but it's also a big problem in groundwater. It's getting into the groundwater, and it stays in the groundwater a lot longer. So why should I care? Well, if you have high blood pressure, drinking sodium is not going to be good. Chloride can make water unpalatable and unfit for some uses. It's very expensive to remove chloride from water. Once chloride gets in water, it does not want to leave. The only thing that'll get it out is reverse osmosis or distillation. Those are 2 of the most energy intensive, expensive ways to treat water. So we're getting into a situation where there are parts of the upper Midwest that are losing the use of a lot of their shallow aquifers. The chlorides are getting too high. If they can't blend it, they can't afford to treat it. So and we'll talk about this in a bit. These chlorides also cause corrosion in the distribution system. And that's a very big concern in terms of things like copper and lead. Matter of fact, if you all familiar with Flint, well, what happened in Flint is, to save money, they switched from a source from Lake Huron, which was low chloride, to the Flint River. So the chloride levels in their feed water went from 11 parts per million chloride to something around 90 parts per million chloride. So the water the water they were using was very corrosive. The mistake they made is they did not adjust for this. They should have been putting in corrosion inhibitors. One common one is like a phosphate, but they're things you can put in to protect the pipes from the corrosion. They switched waters, they didn't do anything about the corrosion, and they got lead and copper leaching out of the service lines. So that's you've heard about the children that were poisoned and the lawsuits and the people going to jail. It was a tragedy that could have been avoided, but they didn't know about it because they were not paying attention to the corrosion. I work with a lot of water utilities. They only sample for chlorides every 10 years. Some don't even sample for that. I know that there are communities out there that have chlorides that have gone up considerably from the last time they sampled for it. They could have lead and copper in their water now that they're not aware of because they're not aware of the chloride issue. So I'm just putting it out there that this isn't something you can just ignore. So trying to get a handle on how bad the road salt contamination is in a state is not easy. In Wisconsin, like I said, a lot of these communities are only sampling about every 10 years. So I did a search in 2016 of the DNR public drinking water database, and I came up with 46 wells in 20 municipalities that had sodium over 20 and chloride over 100. But I also came up with a lot of systems that hadn't sampled for chloride in a long time. So I know, and I just showed a distribution of the systems that I saw that came up with problems, and that's these red flags. And it's sprinkled around the state, but they tend to be the areas that use a lot of road salt, and those are the areas that have the major highways. So there are more out there that just haven't been sampled. You can suspect they're going to be in these red areas because that's where the salt is being used. And one thing you'll notice, there's absolutely nothing in Milwaukee County. Well, they use a lot of salt in Milwaukee County. They just don't have groundwater for drinking water. So they're not, the DNR has no drinking water samples for Milwaukee County. So the groundwater in Milwaukee County is very likely to have high chlorides, but currently nobody's monitoring it. So just show you what this looks like. And I've taken the names off of the graphs. This is data that came from the Wisconsin DNR public drinking water database. This is a well in central Wisconsin, Marathon County. And back in 1995, the chlorides were about 55. They're now over 250. And the sodium was about, maybe 25. Sodium's now 150. So the sodium is 7 times the health advisory. This is another unnamed municipality in southeast Wisconsin. And back in 1985, chloride was down, below 10. So is sodium. Chloride's now over 250. Sodium is like 150. These are some of the worst that I've seen. They're not the worst that I've seen, but there are many more out there that have not been sampled, so we just don't know about them. Even in Madison, which has sandstone wells, the 2 wells we just looked at are sand and gravel wells. You'd expect them to be the most sensitive. Madison has sandstone wells that are 800 feet deep. Some of them are sealed against a confining layer and only are open to a very deep layer. Some are open to a shallower sandstone, which will get a little more recent water, but they are 800-foot deep wells with typically 100, 200 feet of casing. Their chloride levels in their wells several of the wells are going up significantly, 246 to 551% in 3 of their wells between 75 and 2004. One of the wells, the chloride levels went up tenfold from 1975 to 2012. Sodium levels have doubled in that well. These are 800-foot deep sandstone wells. And the sodium levels have done something, are very similar. So just give you a kind of a graphic that I have to give Dane County and Madison credit for being very proactive on the data on their chloride levels and their road salt issues. They have a website. They have all this data is publicly available. They are not hiding it. They're putting it out there. They know they have a problem. So I'm not picking on them. This is going on in other places. They're just brave enough to share it. So anyway, this is 1975. This is Madison suburbs. And we're going to be looking at the change in chloride levels in their wells over time. So 75, not much to see. 1980, you see these red dots pop up. These red dots are where the wells are, and the size of the dots are proportional to the level of chloride in those wells. So you can see we've got a well on the isthmus. That's a lot of traffic, a lot of road salt, and then here a little further west. Jump ahead to 85, not much change. 1990, not much change. 2000, boom. Now it's spreading all through the suburbs. 2005, 2010. So you can just see what started as a problem in the heart of the city, it's now all the way around the Madison metro area. Northeast Illinois, this is data from 2010, and this is the chloride levels in the shallow aquifer. And these big red dots are where it's over 200. The smaller red dots are where it's over 100. So you can see kind of out here in the burbs where there's a lot of sand and gravel, you've got a lot of wells that are now over 200 parts per million chloride. And the rate of increase, in some of these places, it's over 4 parts per million per year. We jump to Kane County. This is the rate of increase in chloride and sodium from 2003 to 2015, so about 12 years. These big dots are where the chloride has gone up by 200 parts per million in 12 years. The smaller red dots is where it's gone up about 100. And same thing on the sodium. So you can see there are a lot of places where it's gone up between 100 and 200 parts per million in just 12 years. Well, a reminder, my weekly timesheet needs to be submitted by 3 p.m. Okay, time is it? Oh my, I'm working for free now. Anyway, it's not just Illinois, Wisconsin. This is data from the Minnesota. The red dots are areas where the chloride in drinking water wells are over 200. And you can see it's clustered in the Twin City areas. And there's a little bit up here on, I think that's Grand Rapids. I can't really read it. Anyway, mostly it's in the Twin City area. And they've done some, they did some studies and they figured that 78% of the salt that's being brought in is being sequestered in the groundwater. So you just basically, when you bring the road salt in, most of it's going into the groundwater. There are studies out there that show in some places the spikes of the road salt can be very quick. This is from Massachusetts. They had a spike in surface water of up to 8,000 parts per million in 2011 in a little creek. It's next to a freeway. The road salt 20 days later went up to over 400 parts per million. So in some cases it can be very quick. That's not at all typical. Sometimes it takes a lot longer. You can get road salt stuck in fractures in fractured rock or in sediment in stormwater ponds. You can build up road salt in these more stagnant parts of the aquifer where it will sit there and be sequestered. And then when you have a heavy rain period or a drought, you change the flow through that system, you can release that salt again. Or you can have these stormwater ponds where you build up this road salt in the sediment and you get a heavy rain and you flush it through. So you can build up reservoirs of salt in the watershed that can kind of release the salt in years into the future. What does it look like moving through the environment? Well, if you have a single source, like here's a stockpile of salt, or maybe you imagine this might be a single road. So you have a single source. You get a lot of salt entering that area. You got cleaner water off to the sides. Well, because salt water is dense, it sinks. So you can get a kind of a plume moving with depth through the aquifer, but most of the aquifer is still okay. But if you have a bigger source, multiple sources, and you have more loading in the area, basically you get a salt dose that fully penetrates the aquifer. So anybody who kind of thinks about those people living on the coast that overpump their aquifers and they get saltwater intrusion, and you feel kind of slightly smug about those foolish people living on the coast. Well, what we have here is locally grown saltwater intrusion for the landlocked. Just a quick case history. This is a project out in New Hampshire. There's a well in this little mountain valley. Capture zone is pretty much defined by the mountain valley. Chloride and sodium levels have been going up. This is starting in 95, about 80 on sodium, up to 140 by 2007, and sodium going up similarly. They installed a series of monitoring wells and got water quality samples at different elevations. So this is a contour of chloride levels with depth across the cross section. Here's the pumping well. Okay. And you'll see the highways right here. So you have a kind of a plume of salt water that's dropping through the aquifer from the source. So it's high salt dropping down. But because you're pumping here, you're causing the water to upwell. So you have, this would be called, in the coast, this would be called upwelling, upconing of salt. So you're upconing salt water into your production well. So what would be a potential solution here? You could put in a scavenger well and pump that salt water out before it gets to your production well. And if you put it down here, you can keep the gradient going down. So you could protect your production well by pumping a fraction of the water from the scavenger well. And you'd have to dispose of it some way that could handle the salt. Another thing we can look at is doing salt balances. Basically, this is a problem of loading into a flow system. If our loading rate is too high, we're going to have big problems. If the loading rate is managed, we can maybe live with it. So we actually have looked at doing saltwater loading studies on some of these basins. This is an example from Marshfield, Wisconsin. It's in the central part of the state. This is a well field that they've had for over 50 years. It's call it the South Well Field. There are 5 or 6 wells in the well field. We did a couple of groundwater models for the well field, so we knew what the capture zone was. This is a groundwater divide. So all the water from that well field is coming from this area. Chloride levels have been going up. This is starting in like 1985. This is about 2015 here. And chloride levels have gone from 50 to about 150. A couple of the wells are a little lower. And there actually was a trend from this is 2011, down to about 2013. Actually, chloride levels were going down a bit. We did a mass balance study to figure out what were going to be the future trends on chloride levels. We're going to keep going up. Were they going to level off? What could they do? So very simple, we just calculated the number of roads, lane miles in the area. We got loading rate from the state for the highways. We got the salt loading rate from the DPW of the city. And then we kind of guesstimated what they might be using in the airport area. We figured that there was somewhere between 926 to 1,500 tons of salt being used annually in that area. So that's our loading factor. We also knew the infiltration because we had done a groundwater model. So we knew that about 10% of the precipitation was infiltrating. So we assumed that 10% of that salt would be infiltrating the groundwater. We were able to calculate that the salt levels, chloride levels, should balance out somewhere between 100 and 150 parts per million, which is about what they were at. It's been 10 years now, and they look like they're leveling out. This is because of this groundwater divide, the water that's going to this well field is only about 10 years old. So the good news is if they reduce their salt loading, they'll see improvement in 5 or 10 years. And that's what's been happening. But if the salt budget had said that, no, you're going to 300, 500 parts per million, like some places are, what do you do then? Well, that's when the hard work begins. Okay, you're going to need a more accurate definition of your capture zone. You're going to have to look at 3D groundwater flow. There's a density factor. So you're going to have to look at the density flow in the aquifer too. You have to look at ways of reducing your loading. Maybe ways of getting more fresh water in. If you can capture more fresh water in the summer and infiltrate it into the aquifer, you can dilute some of that salt loading. So there are several things you can do. You look at scavenger wells. If all else fails, treatment, very expensive. Or maybe you have to decide, okay, this well in 10 years is no longer going to be usable. We need to start looking to replace it now. So there are things you can do, but only if you know it's coming. First thing is monitor your chloride levels. hate to sound like a nag, but it really upsets me that we are not sampling our wells annually for chloride. It costs about $10 to sample for it. I've actually had conversations with people that are in a position to change that, and I think there is frankly, there's a fear of what they'll find out. So people are not very eager to do this, but I think they should. If we know there's a problem coming, we can do things to mitigate. And also, if we know our water is getting more corrosive because of chlorides, we know to be checking lead and copper so we don't have people getting sick or lawsuits. So besides monitoring, it's really important to know where your water is coming from. Every municipality has to have a wellhead protection zone for their municipal well in Wisconsin, and I think the same is true in Illinois. But you can do very simplistic fixed radiuses or very simplistic groundwater models, and that's okay if all you're trying to do is, get a handle on kind of where the water is coming from and where you should be looking for, like landfills and gas stations and things. But if we're talking about road salt, we may need to know a much more accurate wellhead protection zone, and or capture area. That will require a more sophisticated groundwater model. You'll have to look at the three-dimensional flow in the aquifer, and you'll have to look at interference from other wells. So it's not going to be enough to just do one of these very simplistic back-of-the-envelope estimates. You can go out and identify hot spots. Okay, go out with a geoprobe, take samples. There's geophysical methods you can use to find where you have salt built up in the soils or the shallow water. And if you find areas where you've got high pockets of salt, you should be able to remove them or somehow control them before they flow out and get into the main aquifer. Don't stockpile snow in the capture zone of your well. If you know you have what the capture zone is, you don't want big piles of salty snow sitting there to melt in spring. Marshfield had a situation where we found a potential well site for them. The chlorides were over 200, but the water superintendent knew that that's where I think it was a Fleet Farm parking lot, or maybe it was a Walmart, but it was a big box parking lot where everything drained off into this little creek that went right by the potential well site. So they went and they just changed the grading to get that stormwater off that parking lot to go into another little creek. And they actually dropped the chlorides over a few years to around 100 from 200. It's now a well. So sometimes it's very simple to fix the problem. Stormwater, okay? I'm all in favor of infiltrating stormwater into groundwater. I think it's a great thing. Getting stormwater in the ground is great. Getting road salt in the ground is bad, okay? So all these permeable porous pavements and little rain garden features, it's a good idea, but we don't want to let the road salt runoff get into these features because we're just pumping it into the groundwater. We're trading a problem that lasts for a few weeks in surface water. We're trading it for a problem that's going to last for decades in the groundwater. So I'd suggest, if we're concerned about chlorides, maybe we just have to rethink how we handle stormwater. Some of these stormwater systems, you've got a forebay that's for sedimentation, and then you got your infiltration basin. Well, what if we just monitored conductivity in that forebay, and times of the year where that's coming in real high conductivity, so we know it's salty, that water we don't infiltrate. That water we slowly bleed off into surface water or someplace else, maybe through the wastewater treatment plant. I don't know, just not into the groundwater. And then when the conductivity drops, where it's good, clean water, then infiltrate as much as we can. And one of the last things is, I think as we look forward, we're going to have to start factoring in road salt and chloride loading into how we site wells. There's a whole string of things that you have to look at, potential contaminant sources, before you get a well site approved. Road salt contamination is not one of them. We have started thinking about this now. When we are picking a well, we won't go anywhere near a stormwater pond. We won't go try to stay away from major intersections, big box stores, because we know we're going to have chloride issues. So we are trying to look for areas where we can, find a green belt, find a park, find an area that's not likely to have a lot of road salt use, and we try to put our wells in those areas. I think it's something we're going to have to be consciously thinking about, and especially if we're looking at trying to develop more conservation land, let's tie that conservation land into potential well field areas too. Get another benefit from that conservation easement. So, living with road salt. Can we have safe roads and wells? Well, obviously, we need both, okay? There are mitigation efforts out there that are reducing salt loading. People are much more aware of it now than they were 10 years ago, so that's also a very positive step. They're going to be, not going to be easy. I mean, we need to have clear roads, so we're not going to get away with stopping to use salt. There are alternative things you can use like molasses, and I've been hearing about fish proteins that they're looking at. I mean, these things are all possible, but they all have their downsides. But we have to be aware of the problem, be looking for solutions. And I think I'm out of time, but that's what I had to share, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you. Okay, I've been told it's time for questions if there are any. Yes, sir.
We're 100% reliant on groundwater for our drinking water, so we really do monitor our chloride in the county.
Right.
And our Division of Transportation has been a leader in sensible salt, is what we call it. So the use of liquids is one of the main tools in the toolbox, and they've been doing anti-icing, where you put the brine down before a storm, and that prevents ice from forming. But over the past 5 years, they've also been using liquid only for de-icing. So they started out with one route to see how it works. They now have 4 routes. Each one of those routes has a 38% reduction in salt use. And that translates into a 38% reduction in chlorides and a 38% reduction in cost. So we're making the roads safer. Salt actually needs to be wet to be active. So by putting it down in a brine form, you're putting it down in an active form. And so you're making the roads safer, reducing pollution, and saving taxpayer dollars.
And that is exactly what you need to be doing. And I'm glad to hear it, because I've actually had to walk away from 2 well sites in McHenry County in the last 10 years because of chlorides that were 180, getting up there. So yeah, I'm glad to hear you're doing it. I know other communities are doing that too. And that's just the kind of stuff we need to be doing. So thank you for sharing that.
It's still only less bad though.
Yeah.
You're still finding the problem, but you're less bad.
Right, and as we add more parking lots and more lane miles, we're going to still have to cope with it. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about the use of conductivity as a surrogate for sodium chloride in the rivers and wells?
Yeah, they in general terms, yes. I'm not a geochemist, but the conductivity meter is essentially measuring total dissolved solids, and then you have to make a conversion from that conductivity measurement to whatever element that you're concerned with. So if it's just total dissolved solids, it's usually 60 to 70%. You take that value, multiply it by 0.6, 0.7, that gives you your TDS. Now, if you're looking at chlorides, you have to know something about the water chemistry. Like some waters have a lot of sulfate. So, you'd have to correct for that. In this case, we're looking at mostly chloride. We don't really have to worry about high sulfates. It's mostly chloride. So to do it right, you'd have to get some water chemistry data and calibrate the conductivity to the chloride level in those samples. You can get a calibration curve, and then you can use that as a proxy for what your chloride levels are. But just in general, the higher the conductivity, the higher chloride levels are going to be. Does that help?
Yeah, and when you were talking about the $10 chloride test,
If you're sending in major ions, and I'm old in my thinking, it might be $30 now, but it's very cheap. If you're sending in a list of major ions for your groundwater sample and you add chloride, it's a very simple test to run. It's just a few tens of dollars extra to put that on your list of all the ions that you're running.
It's in process. So for different kind of water conditions, we're trying to come up with for chloride, not chloride. I hope I'm not over speaking, but that's probably what we're trying to do. So there will be something coming from us.
They're developing a great tool for chlorides in southeast Wisconsin. They previewed it for me, and it looks really good. Oh.
Well, I'm curious, as you work in these communities, the further on down you look in a watershed, theoretically, these chlorides are going downstream. You see communities downstream being more susceptible to increased chlorides the further down the watershed you go.
Well, you know, a lot of these sand and gravel aquifers are more local flow systems. So the flow system may only be, 10 miles, not 100 miles. So, but yeah, in general, like when you get, especially, if you're near a river, the river and it's in the downtown area, the chlorides are going to be high. And if you get kind of in the more rural area and kind of the outlying, lower chlorides. Yeah. Oh, yes, Tom.
It's affected well sightings or concentrations of chloride. When is a well, is 200 milligrams per liter of chloride, does that essentially make that well unusable? And then also, what concentrations are you concerned about when you get that terrible leaching of the metal?
Yeah, there's no standard for chloride. So theoretically, you could be pumping 500 parts per million into someone's home. But the water superintendent doesn't want to take those calls because it's going to put spots on glasses, leave spots on cars, and people are not going to want to drink it. Whenever we get chlorides over like 50, I start telling people, be worried about this well. When they're over 100, I sit down and I have a conversation with them like, okay, I don't know what it's going to be in 20 years. Right now, people will drink it, but if it gets much higher, people will complain. When it gets up over 200, my advice is, walk away. Just don't, cut your losses. In terms of corrosivity, it really is the change. In Flint, it went from 11 to 90, and that caused a big slug of copper and lead. And it's the corrosivity index too. So I don't have a hard and fast number, but if you get, 30–40% increase in chlorides, I'd be very worried about, your water's no longer in equilibrium with the plumbing, and especially if it's a change that's happened in like 10 years. And you could be mobilizing things. And it's not just lead and copper, there's all kinds of things that can be mobilized out of those pipes. So.
Thanks so much. And Jeff and Cindy and Gary, any final thoughts or closing remarks?
Yeah. So just a reminder about it's our Fox River Day. You all want to offer your thank you anywhere in the watershed. So whatever you do, I encourage you to commit to doing it and work on being creative and register. And Friends of the Fox River is here to help you with the planning